Welcome to Rare Wheel Stories, and this is our list of the 30 most flawed and weirdest V8 engines ever made. Not every V8 engine was a success. Some were ambitious, but flawed, while others were just plain bizarre. From unreliable experiments to over-engineered disasters, these engines proved that even the best ideas can go horribly wrong. With that in mind, let's take a look at 30 of the most flawed and weirdest V8 engines ever made. Some you may remember, others you won't believe existed. So let's dive in. Starting at number 30, we have the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel V8. In the late 1970s, General Motors had a big idea. Take advantage of the fuel crisis by offering diesel-powered passenger cars that would sip fuel instead of guzzling it. Instead of designing a diesel engine from the ground up, Oldsmobile engineers took a shortcut. They converted their existing 350 cubic inch gasoline V8 into a diesel. The result, one of the most disastrous engines in automotive history, the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch diesel V8. At first, the numbers looked promising. The 5.7-liter diesel produced 120 horsepower and 220 pounds of torque, which wasn't terrible for the time. More importantly, it boasted fuel economy figures of around 30 miles per gallon on the highway, far better than the thirsty V8s of the era. But under the hood, it was a mechanical time bomb. Unlike dedicated diesel engines, which feature reinforced blocks and robust internal components to handle high compression, Oldsmobile's diesel was essentially a gasoline engine with minor modifications. The engine operated at a compression rate of 22.5 to 1, far higher than a gasoline engine, but too much for its weak block. Oldsmobile retained the 10-bolt cylinder head pattern from the gasoline version. Bad move. Diesel engines generate enormous internal pressures, and these bolts simply weren't strong enough to keep the head sealed. As a result, head gaskets failed regularly, leading to coolant leaks, overheating, and warped cylinder heads. If left unchecked, these issues could, and often did, result in total engine failure. The fuel system was another nightmare. Unlike well-engineered diesels, which include water separators to remove contaminants, Oldsmobile's 5.7-liter diesel lacked this crucial feature. The low-quality diesel fuel of the era contained water and debris, which led to corroded injectors, clogged fuel lines, and poor combustion. Excessive carbon buildup further choked the engine, causing misfires and a noticeable drop in power. Reliability was so poor that GM found itself drowning in warranty claims. Some engines didn't even last 30,000 miles before catastrophic failure. Frustrated owners joined class action lawsuits, and GM eventually had to settle, offering buybacks and extended warranties. By the mid-1980s, the damage was done. The 5.7-liter diesel had destroyed consumer confidence in diesel cars, and GM pulled the plug in 1985. Today, the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel V8 is remembered as one of the worst engines ever made. A cautionary tale of what happens when cost-cutting meets bad engineering. It wasn't just a failure. It nearly killed the diesel passenger car market in America for decades. At number 29, we have the Triumph Stag V8. The Triumph Stag, a car that set out to be a refined British Grand Tourer with a smooth V8 burble, but ended up being an unreliable nightmare. Introduced in 1970, the Stag came equipped with a 3.0-liter V8, producing around 145 horsepower and 167 pounds of torque. On paper, it looked like a winner. Buyers had the option of a 4-speed manual with overdrive or a 3-speed automatic, promising a mix of performance and cruising comfort. The design, influenced by Michelotti, was stunning, and the open-top motoring experience added to its charm. But beneath that sleek body lurked an engine that seemed determined to self-destruct. One of the biggest issues was overheating, which seemed almost inevitable. The water pump was mounted absurdly high on the engine block, meaning that even a small drop in coolant level could leave the pump unable to circulate fluid properly. And just to make things worse, Triumph paired an iron block with aluminum heads. If you're unaware, those materials expand at different rates when heated. This constant stress led to blown head gaskets, warped heads, and of course, even more overheating. Owners also had to use corrosion-inhibiting antifreeze religiously, or the cooling system would clog up with rust and debris. Then there were the timing chains, which were more like ticking time bombs. The Stag's single-row timing chains had a nasty habit of stretching and snapping in as little as 25,000 miles. And when they failed, pistons and valves collided in a catastrophic mess, often leaving the engine beyond repair. And if that wasn't bad enough, Triumph's bizarre choice of head stud placement, some bolts vertical, others angled, meant uneven expansion, leading to leaks and even more engine failures. To top it off, Triumph's quality control was a mess. Some Stags left the factory with casting sand still inside the engine block, clogging coolant passages before the car even hit the road. Reliability was so poor that Time magazine later named the Stag one of the 50 worst cars ever made. But despite everything, Triumph still managed to sell around 19,000 Stags in the UK. Many owners, fed up with the breakdowns, swapped out of the original V8 for a Rover V8 or Ford's Essex V6. Today, fewer than 6% of surviving Stags have non-original engines. Prices for well-maintained examples start around €8,495, though values vary based on condition. The Stag had all the right ingredients: style, performance, and open-top driving. But its V8 was a disaster. Coming in at 28 is Cadillac's L62 V864. In 1981, Cadillac decided it was time to change the game with an L62 V864. The idea? A 6.0-liter engine that could seamlessly switch between 8, 6, or 4 cylinders to improve fuel efficiency without sacrificing power. It sounded like magic: 140 horsepower, 265 pounds of torque, and the ability to sip fuel like a 4-cylinder when cruising. But in reality, it was more like a bad party trick: clunky, unreliable, and destined to flop. The magic behind the system was an onboard computer that decided when to shut off cylinders. But this was the early 80s, and computers had about as much processing power as a pocket calculator. The result? The engine would hesitate, jerk, and occasionally forget what it was supposed to be doing. Instead of a smooth transition, drivers got the sensation of their car having a mild identity crisis every few seconds. The real stars of the show were the 16 solenoids controlling the cylinder deactivation. Or at least, they were supposed to be. In practice, they were as dependable as a weather forecast, failing frequently and leaving drivers wondering whether they had a V8, a V6, or just an expensive brick under the hood. In the fuel injection system, it didn't always cooperate, sometimes overloading the active cylinders with too much fuel, leading to rough running and even worse fuel economy than our regular V8. Cadillac knew it had a disaster on its hands and scrambled to fix it, issuing 13 software updates to try and salvage the system. But this was like putting band-aids on a sinking ship. Most owners just had the feature permanently disabled, turning their fancy variable displacement V8 into a normal gas-chugging dinosaur. Predictably, the 864 was scrapped after just 1 year. The idea itself wasn't bad. Modern engines use cylinder deactivation all the time. But in 1981, the technology just wasn't there. Instead of revolutionizing efficiency, Cadillac's ambitious experiment ended up as one of the automotive world's most famous flops. Today, it's mostly remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when a great concept meets terrible execution. Next up at number 27 is the Chevrolet 262 small block. Chevrolet's 262 small block V8 was proof that not all V8s are created equal. Some are just embarrassing. Introduced in 1975, this 4.3-liter 262 cubic inch engine was GM's attempt to combine fuel efficiency with V8 power. Instead, it produced a wheezy 110 horsepower and 195 pounds of torque, making it feel less like a V8 and more like a tired four-cylinder that had eaten too much at lunch. It was the smallest small block Chevy ever made, and unfortunately, it felt like it. One of its biggest sins was its strangled performance. The restrictive intake and exhaust choked any potential life out of the engine, making acceleration an exercise in patience. Merging onto highways became a calculated risk, and owners had to accept that their so-called V8 was getting outrun by six-cylinders and even some four-bangers. Chevrolet promised fuel efficiency, but the results were underwhelming at best. The 262 still drank fuel like a much larger engine, but without all the fun. Then there was the reliability, or lack thereof. Overheating issues were common, thanks to a cooling system that acted more like a suggestion than an actual working component. Blown head gaskets became a standard feature, and timing chains had a nasty habit of stretching early, throwing everything out of sync. If that wasn't enough, the emissions-focused tuning meant the engine ran hot and inefficient, especially in California models, which were even more strangled by emissions regulations. To make things even worse, Chevrolet fitted the 262 with a two-barrel carburetor that struggled to deliver consistent fuel mixtures. This resulted in rough idling, hesitation, and an overall driving experience that could be best described as reluctant. It was like the engine itself didn't want to be there. After just 2 years of disappointing customers, Chevrolet wisely pulled the plug on the 262. It was replaced by engines that actually understood the concept of power and efficiency. Today, the 262 is mostly forgotten, except by those unfortunate souls that had to deal with it firsthand. It remains one of Chevrolet's most baffling V8 decisions, proving that sometimes a bad idea should remain just that, an idea. At number 26, we have the Chrysler LeanBurn V8. In the annals of automotive history, few innovations have been as ambitious and as humorously flawed as Chrysler's LeanBurn system. Picture this. It's the mid-1970s. Disco fever is in full swing, and Chrysler decides to join the party with a high-tech solution to the era's tightening emissions regulations. Enter the LeanBurn system, introduced in 1976, which aimed to make engines run cleaner and more efficiently by adjusting the fuel-air mixture to a leaner ratio, sometimes as high as 18:1, compared to the standard 14.7:1. The system was a technological marvel for its time, featuring a spark control computer mounted conveniently atop the air cleaner, right in the engine bay's sauna of heat and vibration. This computer received input from a plethora of sensors monitoring engine speed, load, throttle position, and air temperature, all working together to fine-tune the engine's performance. The goal? To reduce emissions and improve fuel economy without sacrificing power. On paper, it sounded like a win-win. However, the reality was less Saturday Night Fever and more mechanical misstep. The computer's placement made it susceptible to the very heat and vibrations it was supposed to endure, leading to frequent failures. It's almost as if placing sensitive electronics in the harshest environment possible wasn't the best idea. Who knew? Drivers soon found their vehicles exhibiting a range of charming behaviors: stumbling, stalling, and a general reluctance to run properly. The LeanBurn system's attempt to fine-tune the engine's timing and fuel mixture often resulted in performance that could generously be described as lethargic. The engine's power output was less roar of a lion and more meow of a kitten. Mechanics of the era were equally baffled. The complexity of the system, combined with its propensity for failure, led many to rip out the LeanBurn components entirely, reverting it to traditional carburetors and distributors. It was a time when the sight of a Chrysler rolling into the shop elicited groans and the occasional eye roll. Despite its noble intentions, the LeanBurn system became synonymous with unreliability. Chrysler continued to tinker with the technology in the 1980s, but the damage to its reputation was done. While the concept of this engine was forward-thinking, the execution left much to be desired, cementing its place in automotive history as a well-intentioned but ultimately flawed innovation. At number 25, we have the Ford Flathead V8. Let me present to you the Ford Flathead V8, an engine that changed the game and then proceeded to trip over its own shoelaces. When it debuted in 1932, it was revolutionary, bringing V8 power to the masses at an affordable price. Before this, V8 engines were the expensive toys of luxury brands, but Ford made sure that every man could have one under the hood. It was a 221 cubic inch 3.6-liter engine that made a modest 65 horsepower, which doesn't sound like much, but back then, it was enough to make people feel like they were flying. It was simple, rugged, and easy to work on, which made it a favorite among hot rodders for decades. But as much as it was loved, the Flathead had more problems than a soap opera protagonist. One of the biggest issues was its exhaust design, or, as some mechanics called it, the built-in engine toaster. Instead of routing the exhaust out efficiently, the gases had to snake their way through passages inside the block, meaning the engine was basically heating itself up from the inside. This led to frequent overheating, especially in warmer climates where flatheads boiled over faster than a teapot on high heat. The coiling systems struggled to keep up, leading to warped heads, cracked blocks, and frustrated owners. Imagine that. Then there was the airfill problem. The Flathead used a side valve, or L-head design, where the valves sat beside the cylinders instead of above them. This layout made for a compact engine, but it also strangled its own performance. Air and fuel had to take a long, awkward detour to reach the combustion chamber, limiting power and efficiency. While it was fine for a leisurely drive in the 1930s, by the time the 50s rolled around, the Flathead was being outclassed by overhead valve V8s that could breathe properly. Durability was another mixed bag. While the Flathead was built to last, the combination of poor cooling and inefficient design meant it often met an untimely demise. The three main bearing crankshaft design wasn't the most robust, and oiling issues sometimes led to premature wear. To make matters worse, the factory tolerances were so loose that rebuilding one often felt like an archaeological excavation, with mechanics discovering all sorts of strained machining inconsistencies. Despite all these flaws, the Flathead V8 remained a legend, proving that sometimes even the most flawed engines can still capture hearts. But let's be honest, it earned its spot on this list because of its historical importance. It was a mechanical headache wrapped in nostalgia. Up next at 24 is the Dodge RV 441 V8. The Dodge RV 441 V8 engine was like a behemoth that promised to turn your motorhome into a rolling thunderstorm, but often ended up as a drizzle of disappointment. Buckle up, folks. This ride's about to get bumpy. Introduced in the 1970s, the Dodge 441 was a 7.2-liter V8 engine, boasting a bore of 4.32 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. It featured a cast iron block and heads with a compression ratio of 8.2 to 1. Equipped with a 4-barrel carburetor, this engine was designed to deliver the grunt needed to propel hefty motorhomes down the highway. On paper, it turned out around 225 horsepower at 4,000 RPM, a figure that seemed impressive for its time. However, the reality was less exhilarating. The 441 was notorious for its insatiable thirst for fuel, guzzling gasoline faster than a college freshman downs energy drinks during finals week. Owners often joked that the fuel gauge was more of a countdown timer than an indicator, watching in dismay as it plummeted towards empty with every mile. But the fuel consumption was just the tip of the iceberg. The engine's design had some quirks that led to a cascade of issues. The cooling system, for instance, was about as effective as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Overheating became a common theme, especially during uphill climbs or in warmer climates. The inadequate cooling often resulted in warped heads and blown gaskets, leaving travelers stranded on the side of the road. their dreams of adventure evaporating like steam from the radiator. The ignition system was another Achilles heel. The 441 employed a points-based ignition setup that was prone to misfires and required frequent adjustments. It was as if the engine had a mind of its own, deciding to take unscheduled breaks just when you needed it most. Many a vacation was interrupted by impromptu roadside tune-ups, with frustrated owners cursing the day they trusted this mechanical miscreant. Then there was the weight. The engine was a heavyweight champion, tipping the scales and adding significant bulk to the motorhome. This extra mass not only affected fuel efficiency, but also handling, making the vehicle feel more like a lumbering elephant than a nimble gazelle. Navigating tight corners or steep inclines became a white-knuckle affair, while drivers praying that the brakes, already under immense strain, would hold up under the pressure. Maintenance was no picnic either. Assessing various components required contortionist skills, and parts seemed to be placed in the most inconvenient locations possible. Changing a simple hose or belt often turned into a marathon session, testing the patience and resolve of even the most seasoned DIY mechanics. In the end, the Dodge RV441 V8 engine became infamous for turning leisurely road trips into epic sagas of mechanical woe. So, here's to the 441, a failure that would have you regret all your life's choices. Coming in hot. See what I did there? At number 23 is the Pontiac 265 V8. Ladies and gentlemen, rev up your engines and brace yourself as we unveil number 23 on our list of V8 misfires, the 1980 to 1981 Pontiac 265 cubic inch V8. A pint-sized powerhouse that promised performance but delivered little more than a sputter. In the twilight years of Pontiac's V8 production, the 265 cubic inch engine emerged as a response to tightening emissions regulations and the quest for fuel efficiency. Sporting a bore of 3.75 inches and a stroke of 3 inches, this engine was essentially a scaled-down version of Pontiac's larger V8s. It featured a cast iron block and heads, adhering to the traditional overhead valve design with 2 valves per cylinder. The compression ratio was a modest 8.0 to 1, and depending on the carburetor setup, it produced between 162 and 195 horsepower. On paper, the 265 seemed like a sensible solution for the era's challenges. However, in practice, it left much to be desired. Drivers quickly discovered that this engine had all the enthusiasm of a sloth on a lazy Sunday. Acceleration was lethargic, making merging onto highways a test of patience and prayer. The engine's diminutive displacement struggled to move the hefty vehicles it was placed in, leading to performance that could generously be described as underwhelming. Fuel efficiency, the very goal this engine aimed to achieve, was another letdown. Owners reported that the 265 guzzled gas with the gusto of its larger V8 siblings, negating any supposed economic benefits. It was as if the engine had an identity crisis, consuming fuel like a big block while delivering the power of a lawnmower. Reliability issues further tarnished the 265's reputation. The engine was prone to overheating, a consequence of its reduced size and demands placed upon it. Cooling systems struggled to keep temperatures in check, leading to frequent breakdowns and costly repairs. Additionally, the oil filtration system was inadequate, resulting in premature wear and tear. Pistons were known to crack at the skirt around 30,000 miles, causing a deep knocking noise during acceleration. The 265's lackluster performance and reliability woes were compounded by its timing. As General Motors shifted towards corporate engines, the unique Pontiac V8s were phased out in favor of standardized power plants. The 265 was among the last of its kind, and its shortcomings only hastened Pontiac's transition away from their proprietary engine designs. Alas, it was an engine that aimed to balance performance and efficiency, but ended up excelling at neither. A true testament to the adage, if you try to please everyone, you might end up pleasing no one. At number 22, we have the Dodge Red Ram Hemi. Nothing screams high-performance V8 disaster like an engine that spent its life trying to prove it belonged at the big kids table. Chrysler had 3 separate Hemi V8 families in the 1950s, and Dodge somehow ended up with the runt of the litter. With a mere 241 cubic inches, the Red Ram was Chrysler's idea of a compact Hemi. But let's be honest, it was compact in the same way a toy poodle is still technically a dog. Now, let's get to the real problem. Dodge wanted to market the Red Ram as both an economy and performance engine, which is like trying to make a salad taste like a cheeseburger. The original 1953 version had a 3.4375-inch bore and a 3.25-inch stroke, paired with a lowly 7.1-to-1 compression ratio. That's right, this was a Hemi that could run on regular gas, not because it was efficient, but because it had all the compression of a deflated beach ball. With a bore spacing of just 4.1875 inches, the Red Ram was the smallest of Chrysler's Hemis, meaning it already started life as the least intimidating member of the family. Dodge kept bumping up displacement in later years, 270 cubic inches in 1955, then 315 and 325 cubic inches in 1956 and 1957. But the problem wasn't size. It was that this engine never quite figured out what it wanted to be. Unlike its Chrysler and DeSoto siblings, which went all in on performance, the Red Ram was marketed as fuel efficient. But here's the joke. It wasn't. With its big, heavy Hemi heads, it drank fuel like an overenthusiastic frat boy at a keg party. And despite all the extra weight, it wasn't exactly breaking speed records. The Red Ram was like a heavyweight boxer with no knockout punch. Slow, inefficient, and expensive to maintain. Speaking of weight, that was another big problem. The Red Ram had dual rocker shafts per cylinder head, a massive valve train setup, and castings that made it unnecessarily complicated. This thing was as over-engineered as a spaceship, but without any of the actual performance benefits. It made decent power in later Dash 1 versions, up to 296 horsepower in 1956, but at that point, Dodge had already decided it was done with the whole Hemi experiment. By 1957, Chrysler had figured out that building 3 different Hemi families was a financial black hole, and the Red Ram was the first to get the boot. The entire Dodge Hemi program was replaced by wedge-head V8s, which were simpler, cheaper, and brace yourself, actually worked. So while the Red Ram had the word Hemi attached to it, it ultimately ended up as an expensive, inefficient oddity that no one really wanted to keep around. Moving on to 21 is the Ford Y-Block V8. When Ford finally ditched the Flathead V8 in 1954, the Y-Block was supposed to be a game changer. Instead, it became a nightmare. Sure, it had a deep-skirted block for extra strength, but what good is durability when the engine can't even keep itself lubricated? Ford's first overhead valve engine turned out to be an oil-starved air-choking disaster. Engines need oil, but the Y-Block had other ideas. Designed for high detergent oils, it struggled when owners used cheap non-detergent ones. Oil passages clog faster than a junk food addict's arteries, starving the rocker arm and top-end components. Suddenly, valve lifters were clattering like a haunted typewriter, and owners were left wondering why their fancy new engine sounded like a diesel truck with a grudge. Even worse, Ford's design flaws ensured that even with the right oil, the top end barely got lubrication. Crankshafts and cylinder heads often misaligned, blocking the flow entirely. Ford's solution? Slap an external oil tube onto later models, essentially duct tape on a sinking ship. If choking on oil wasn't bad enough, the Y-Block also struggled with airflow. Ford, in its infinite wisdom, stacked the intake ports vertically instead of placing them side by side. This bizarre design killed airflow. Wow, imagine that. Making high RPM performance a joke. While the Y-Block could rev past 7,000 RPM, it was gasping for air long before then. Chevy's small block, introduced in 1955, outperformed it in every way, leaving the Y block wheezing in the dust. The deep skirted block made the Y block incredibly rigid, but also unnecessarily heavy. It was built like a tank, but it moved like one too. Meanwhile, Chevy's lightweight small block V8 danced circles around it. Despite increasing displacement to 312 cubic inches, the Y block still couldn't keep up. By 1964, Ford had seen enough. The Y block, once meant to revolutionize Ford's V8 lineup, had instead become a cautionary tale. Between its oiling issues, airflow struggles, and unnecessary weight, it was clear this engine wasn't built to last. It was built to fail. Coming in next at number 20 is the Chrysler A279 dual overhead cam V8. Chrysler's A279 dual overhead cam V8 was meant to be a game changer like others on this list. Instead, it turned into an expensive, over-engineered mess that never saw the light of day. Designed to replace multiple engine families and simplify production, it somehow managed to do the exact opposite. Chrysler wanted a high-performance alternative to the 426 Hemi that was cheaper to build. What they got was an engineering nightmare that left them with nothing but wasted money and a single surviving prototype. One of the biggest problems, the valve train. Chrysler replaced the Hemi's rocker shafts with ball stud rockers, thinking they'd save weight and cost. Instead, they created a mess. The system wore out too quickly, suffered from poor oiling, and lacked stability at high RPMs. The combustion chamber wasn't even fully hemispherical, ruining airflow. Worse still, the intake and exhaust ports were positioned in a way that made tuning difficult and performance inconsistent. Chrysler even experimented with a vertically split intake manifold because apparently they wanted to make mechanics cry. Then came the oiling disaster. Chrysler engineers knew lubrication was a problem, so they added extra drainback holes. Did it work? Not really. The engine still suffered from oil starvation at high speeds, which was a pretty big issue for a performance V8. The compression ratio was supposed to be 10.5 to 1, but the only surviving engine was measured at 9.8 to 1, meaning it didn't even have the power it was designed for. Even the forged connecting rods were weaker than the ones found in the 426 Hemi, making the whole thing feel like a downgrade. Cooling problems were another headache. The large bore required extra cleanout holes to remove casting sand, proving Chrysler was scrambling to make it work. And as if that wasn't enough, they even considered using a smaller oil pump pickup. But endurance tests quickly revealed how terrible of an idea that was. By late 1969, the A279 was finished, and not in a good way. Emissions regulations were tightening, muscle cars were losing favor, and Chrysler was drowning financially. With no money left to fix an engine that still wasn't production ready, they of course pulled the plug. Some say 3 were built, others claim 12, but only one prototype remains today, a museum piece of what could have been. Chrysler had aimed for innovation, but instead built a mechanical disaster. The A279 was proof that just because something looks good on paper doesn't mean it belongs in a car. At number 19 is the Lancia Thema 832 V8. The Lancia Thema 832 had one job: to be a high-performance luxury sedan with a Ferrari-powered heart. Instead, it became an expensive, high-maintenance headache that left owners questioning their life choices. On paper, everything looked promising. Ferrari's 2.9-liter Tipo F 105-liter V8, 212 horsepower, 210 pounds of torque, and a respectable 0 to 62 miles per hour time of 6.8 seconds. But in reality, this thing had more issues than a soap opera. Let's start with the engine's biggest sin. It was a Ferrari V8 that didn't sound like a Ferrari. Unlike its Maranello cousins, which roared with an aggressive high-revving fury, the Thema 832's power plant was neutered by a cross-plane crankshaft designed by Ducati. The result? A V8 that hummed like a confused sedan rather than the Italian stallion it was supposed to be. Imagine spending a fortune on a Ferrari-powered car only for it to sound like your neighbor's mildly sporty sedan. Heartbreaking. Let's all shed a tear for the rich people. Then came the reliability nightmares. This engine was built for longitudinal placement in the Ferrari 308, but Lancia crammed it transversely under the Thema's hood. That required modifications, and not the good kind. The engineers had to redesign major components, which led to excessive wear, frequent oil leaks, and maintenance bills that could have made a grown man cry. And speaking of maintenance, this was no ordinary oil change and go kind of engine. Oh no. The timing belts had to be replaced every 25,000 miles. Yes, 25,000, which was already short for a V8. Skip that, and you'd be greeted with a catastrophic failure that could turn your Ferrari-powered Lancia into a glorified paperweight. But wait, there's more. Heat management was also a disaster. The compact engine bay turned into a sauna, cooking surrounding components like a fine Italian dish. Cooling problems were so bad that the Thema 832 had a reputation for running hotter than it should, shortening the lifespan of critical parts. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, there was the cost. The Thema 832 was nearly twice the price of a standard Thema. And for what? A car that underperformed against its rivals, had constant mechanical issues, and required Ferrari-level servicing for a Lancia badge? No wonder it sold in tiny numbers. In the end, the Lancia Thema 832's Ferrari V8 was a masterpiece in theory, but a failure in execution. It was proof that sometimes shoehorning an exotic engine into a family sedan creates nothing but problems. And a whole lot of regret. Up next at number 18 is the Rover V8. The Rover V8. A legend? Maybe. A disaster? Absolutely. Born from an American Buick design, this engine should have been a masterpiece. Instead, it aged like expired milk, turning from a lightweight powerhouse into a reliability nightmare. At first, it was solid, an aluminum block with iron liners, pushrod simplicity, and a displacement starting at 3.5 liters, later stretching to 5 liters. Power output ranged from 181 horsepower to a healthy 340 horsepower. But none of that mattered once things started falling apart. At the beginning, Rover engineers did everything right. They pressed the liners into the aluminum block with surgical precision, ensuring nothing moved under heat and stress. But as years passed, so did their attention to detail. By the early 2000s, mechanics were muttering two dreaded words: dropped liners. A phrase that sounds innocent but meant total engine failure. The iron cylinder liners, meant to stay locked in place, began shifting like loose dentures. Once they moved, coolant slipped past them, sneaking into the combustion chamber. Not good. The result? A wrecked engine and an eye-watering $10,000 to $15,000 repair bill. And it doesn't stop there. As emissions laws forced engines to run hotter, the Rover V8's weaknesses became impossible to ignore. A simple overheating event, maybe from a bad water pump or a worn-out hose, could send everything into meltdown. Aluminum and steel expand at different rates if you didn't know, and if the liners weren't secured perfectly, they'd lose grip. Once coolant and oil started mixing, you weren't fixing. You were writing an obituary. But the real horror show came when some engines failed without even overheating. Owners would take their car in for a routine check, only for mechanics to find combustion gases leaking straight into the coolant. No warning, no overheating, just quiet, inevitable doom. The reason? Rover's declining production quality. As tooling wore out, tolerances got sloppy. Some engine castings even had tiny holes where aluminum failed to fill in properly. By the end, the V8 wasn't just unreliable. It was a gamble. It limped along for decades, refusing to die gracefully, until Rover finally pulled the plug on it. Today, it's a reminder of what happens when a good idea meets bad execution. If you see one, admire it from a distance. But don't get too close. It might just take your wallet down with it. And now at number 17 is the Maserati V8. The Maserati V8, a roaring, high-performance masterpiece with enough personality to make any car enthusiast weak at the knees. But for all its exhilarating speed and Italian charm, it had a darker side. This engine wasn't just a work of art. It was also a ticking time bomb if not treated with absolute care. Let's talk about the failures that made Maserati V8 owners develop trust issues. First up, the infamous oil leaks. Maserati V8s were notorious for hemorrhaging oil like a desperate escape attempt. Worn seals, failing gaskets, and aging valve covers turned these engines into oil fountains. Neglect an oil change or ignore a small leak, and you might soon find yourself with an engine gasping for lubrication. And when a V8 runs dry, you're not just looking at an expensive repair. You're looking at a funeral for your engine. Then there was the cooling system, or rather, the lack of a reliable one. These engines ran hot, and Maserati's cooling solutions weren't always up to the task. A failing water pump, a clogged radiator, or a stuck thermostat could turn a casual drive into a high-stakes game of, will it overheat? Overheating led to warped cylinder heads, blown head gaskets, and in worst-case scenarios, catastrophic engine failure. If your temperature gauge started climbing, you had two options: pull over immediately or prepare to open up your wallet wide. Timing chain problems were another nightmare. While many modern engines use timing chains that last a lifetime, Maseratis had a habit of stretching over time. This threw the entire engine's timing off, potentially leading to piston and valve collisions. In the world of engine failures, few things are as brutal or as expensive as a timing failure that leads your pistons smashing into your valves like a demolition crew. And let's not forget rod bearing failure, the silent killer of Maserati V8s. These tiny components kept everything running smoothly. Until they didn't. Starve them of oil and they could wear down, causing a loud knocking sound. Ignore it, and the next sound you'd hear would be your engine self-destructing. Despite these notorious failures, the Maserati V8 remained an icon until its final days in 2024. A thrilling, temperamental masterpiece, this engine wasn't for the faint of heart. Treat it well, and it might reward you. Neglect it, and it would make sure you never forgot the consequences. Coming in at 16, the Cadillac Northstar V8. The Cadillac Northstar V8, an engine so ambitious it tripped over its own complexity and took Cadillac's reputation down with it. At first glance, this 4.6-liter dual overhead cam masterpiece seemed like GM's answer to European luxury powerhouses. It had aluminum construction, 4 valves per cylinder, variable valve timing, and a respectable 300 horsepower output. On paper, it was Cadillac's technological flex. In reality, it was a landmine just waiting to be stepped on by unsuspecting owners. Let's start with its infamous Achilles heel, the head gasket. GM, in a move that can only be described as a cost-cutting gamble gone horribly wrong, used fine thread head bolts that stripped out of the aluminum block over time. The result? Blown head gaskets, catastrophic coolant loss, an overheating nightmare that turned proud Cadillac owners into full-time mechanics. And if you thought replacing the head gasket was a simple fix, you've never worked on cars. It often meant an engine-out repair costing thousands. Oil leaks? Oh, the Northstar had them in spades. Lower crankshaft seals and main gaskets were practically designed to fail, leading to an engine that wept oil like it had just watched the end of the Titanic, which shouldn't have been that sad because she had plenty of room on that thing she was floating on. Many owners found themselves constantly topping up oil, while others simply accepted the self-lubricating driveway as a standard Cadillac feature. And let's not forget the excessive oil consumption, burning through quarts at a rate that would make even two-stroke engines jealous. Then there was the absurd starter replacement. GM, in its infinite wisdom, buried the starter beneath the intake manifold. So when, and not if, the starter failed, you had to remove half the engine's top end just to access it. It was like designing a house where you had to remove the roof to change a light bulb. And let's not forget the Northstar's famous limp home mode, a feature that allowed the engine to run without coolant by alternating cylinder operation to avoid overheating. Sounds smart, right? Except it often led to warped heads and even worse failures, essentially turning a bad situation into a complete disaster. The worst part, GM actually improved the Northstar's reliability in later years. But by then, the damage was done. The earlier years had already cemented its legacy as one of the most expensive and frustrating engines Cadillac ever produced. Today, the Northstar V8 isn't just remembered, it's feared. A cautionary tale of what happens when innovation outruns reliability. It could have been Cadillac's triumph, but instead, it became the luxury brand's mechanical punchline. Coming in next at number 15 is the Lotus 918 V8. In the mid-1990s, Lotus had a bold vision. Create a high-performance V8 engine that would finally give the Esprit the power it deserved. Enter the Type 918, a 3.5-liter twin-turbocharged all-aluminum V8. On paper, it looked like an engineering marvel. Lightweight, compact, and packing 350 horsepower. But in reality, the Type 918 became one of the most notorious engines in Lotus history, plagued by reliability issues that would tarnish its reputation. At first glance, the numbers were impressive. The 3.5-liter V8 featured dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and a flat plane crankshaft for high revving power delivery. Twin Garrett T2560 turbochargers added serious boost, propelling the Esprit V8 from 0 to 60 in just 4.1 seconds. Lotus engineers even claimed the engine was capable of 500 horsepower, but they had to detune it to 350 horsepower. Why? Because the transmission simply couldn't handle the full potential. Instead of designing a new gearbox, Lotus stuck with the aging Renault transaxle, which was barely upgraded to cope with the increased torque. This meant the Type 918 was always operating below what it could have been. But the real problem started under the hood. Early models suffered from a catastrophic issue, leaking cylinder liners. Lotus used Loctite 572 as a sealant, which simply couldn't withstand the extreme heat of the turbocharged engine. As temperature rose, the sealant failed. Imagine that, allowing coolant and oil to mix. The result, a blown engine. Lotus eventually switched to a different sealant in June 2000, but by then, many early Esprit V8s were already doomed. Cooling was another Achilles heel. The engine's high-output nature made it prone to overheating, and the stock cooling system struggled to keep temperatures in check. Some cars even suffered from improperly sealed pressure caps, causing coolant loss and further compounding reliability issues. And if that wasn't enough, Lotus initially recommended a 72,000-mile cam belt change interval, only to later revise it to 24,000 miles. Ignore this, and you were looking at a potential belt failure, another costly disaster. And then there were the turbochargers. While the Garrett units themselves were reliable, poor maintenance habits like revving the engine from cold led to premature failures. Aftermarket ECU chips only made things worse, increasing boost pressures beyond what the engine was designed to handle. In the end, the Type 918 wasn't just flawed, it was a ticking time bomb. While it delivered thrilling performance when running properly, its long-term reliability was a nightmare. Today, it's remembered as one of Lotus's most ambitious but troubled engines. At number 14 is the Aston Martin Laganda 5.3-liter V8. There are bad engines. There are disastrous engines. And then There's the Aston Martin Laganda 5.3-liter V8, a masterpiece of excess, engineering bravado, and catastrophic failure. This was a beast of an engine, an over-engineered, hand-assembled, all-aluminum 5.3-liter V8 with dual overhead cams, a quartet of Weber 48 IDF 2100 carburetors, and enough raw muscle to propel Aston's Laganda and Vantage to ridiculous speeds. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was an absolute nightmare. Let's start with the obvious. This engine drank fuel like an oil tycoon at an open bar. With a power output of 280 to 390 horsepower, depending on the version, and a curb weight that could double as a small moon, the V8's efficiency was about as refined as a brick through a window. But hey, that wasn't even his worst problem. Cooling? Cooling? What's cooling? We don't need no stinking cooling. This engine had a talent for overheating that made it feel more like a built-in sauna than a high-performance powerhouse. The cooling system, despite Aston Martin's best attempts, simply couldn't keep up with the relentless heat the V8 produced. Radiators clogged, thermostats failed, and once the temperature needle climbed too high, things got ugly. Warped cylinder heads, blown head gaskets, and a trip straight to bankruptcy trying to fix it. Then there was the oil situation. The V8 had an insatiable appetite for it, often leaking more oil than it actually burned. If you weren't constantly checking levels, you were one long drive away from an engine seizing up like a rusty door hinge. The rear main seal was notorious for failing, leading to a puddle of expensive regret forming under your pristine Aston Martin. And the carburetors, when tuned properly, delivered a glorious performance. When misaligned, which happened often, they turned the car into an undrivable, fuel-spewing mess. Owners found themselves adjusting the carbs more than they actually drove the car, because if they weren't perfectly synchronized, don't even think about reliability. This engine wasn't just high maintenance. It was a ticking time bomb. We like to use that phrase a lot around here. Timing chains stretched, ignition systems failed, and mechanics often treated these engines like cursed artifacts. And let's not forget about the infamous Chrysler 3-speed automatic transmission option, which was about as suited to handling this engine's power as a paper bag is to carrying bricks. At the end of the day, the Aston Martin 5.3-liter V8 wasn't just flawed. It was an unholy blend of over-engineering and under-delivering. It had the heart of a champion, but the reliability of a hand grenade with a loose pin. Coming in at number 13 is the Nissan VK45DE. The Nissan VK45DE was supposed to be a marvel. A 4.5-liter dual overhead cam V8 that combined power, advanced engineering, and lightweight construction. First introduced in 2002, it boasted an aluminum engine block and heads, titanium valves, forged steel connecting rods, and a micro-finished forged crankshaft. On paper, this was a masterpiece, with an output of 340 horsepower at 6,400 RPM and 333 pounds of torque at 4,000 RPM. It had enough punch to power Infinity's high-end sedans and even found its way into endurance racing. But as time went on, the engine proved to be more of a high-maintenance diva than a durable workhorse. One of the biggest headaches, the front catalytic converters. In regions with poor fuel quality, these converters deteriorated at an alarming rate. And when they broke down, they didn't just stop working. They self-destructed in glorious fashion, sending ceramic dust straight into the cylinders. Imagine your engine breathing in a lungful of sandpaper. The result? Scored cylinder walls, oil consumption through the roof, and in some cases, complete engine failure. Nissan tried to downplay the issue, but owners knew better. If you didn't catch the problem early, your engine was toast. Then came the misfires. Some VK45DEs developed an annoying habit of starting up just fine, only to begin misfiring after a few moments of idling. Cold starts were the worst, but even under normal driving conditions, The engine could stumble, jerk, or backfire. The list of potential culprits read like a laundry list of sensor failures. Mass airflow sensors, NOx sensors, coolant sensors, ignition coils. The VK45DE was packed with so many sensors that diagnosing a single misfire could feel like solving a puzzle blindfolded. And let's not even talk about the timing chain. Normally, a timing chain is supposed to last the life of an engine. Not so with the VK45DE. Many owners found themselves replacing their timing chains before even hitting 100,000 miles. Some unlucky drivers had to deal with it as early as 40,000 miles. A failing chain meant rattling noises, poor engine performance, and the ever-dreaded check engine light. Neglect it long enough and the entire engine could be thrown out of sync, leading to, of course, catastrophic failure. As if all that wasn't enough, the VK45DE also suffered from mass airflow and NOx sensor failures. The mass airflow sensor's job was to measure incoming air and adjust the fuel mixture accordingly. But when it went bad, the engine ran either too rich, too lean, or simply didn't run at all. The NOx sensors meant to detect engine knock and adjust timing were equally unreliable. With both of these failing, owners were often left chasing ghosts under the hood. The VK45DE had all the right ingredients for greatness, but was ultimately let down by weak components and high maintenance demands. Nissan later moved on to more reliable iterations of the VK series, but the 4.5-liter remains an engine that promised a lot and delivered, well, problems. Now we have number 12. It's the Toyota Land Cruiser 1VD V8. Toyota's 1VD FTV was supposed to be a beast, a 4.5-liter V8 turbo diesel designed to power the legendary Land Cruiser through deserts, mountains, and the deepest depths of the outback. And on paper, it looked unstoppable. With a dual overhead cam 32-valve setup, common rail direct injection, and variable geometry turbochargers, the twin-turbo version cranked out 286 horsepower and a monstrous 650 Nm of torque. This engine was built for war. But, in reality, it was an unpredictable, high-maintenance diva that could betray its owners at the worst possible moment. The problem of this engine starts from its injectors. These weren't just your average fuel squirters. They were high-precision, high-maintenance nightmares. When they went bad, the symptoms were all over the place. Rough idling, smoke that could fog up the entire parking lot, and a loss of power so bad, you'd think your Land Cruiser had suddenly transformed into a Prius. But the real kickers are other issues like bad glow plugs, compression leaks, and injector seal failures, mimicking the exact same symptoms. Diagnosing the problem was a game of mechanical roulette. Then there was the plastic oil strainer, a, dare I say, masterpiece in bad engineering. Over time, this fragile piece of plastic degraded, cracked, and worst of all, cut off oil supply to the engine. Yes, you heard that right. Toyota built a mighty diesel V8, then fitted it with an oil pickup that could self-destruct and starve the engine to death. The fix? Swap it for a metal aftermarket one before disaster struck. But wait, it gets worse. The oil filter cap had its own death wish. This seemingly innocent component held the cartridge-style oil filter in place. But if its little spout broke off unnoticed, the filter would collapse, blocking oil flow and leading to, you guessed it, engine failure. You had to check it every time you changed oil, or your V8 could end up as an expensive paperweight. And the airbox? If you dared to use a non-Toyota filter, you might as well have invited a sandstorm into your engine. Dust bypassed cheap filters, sneaking into the cylinders like a silent assassin. The radiator wasn't much better, with its plastic top prone to cracking and coolant leaks forming like unwanted acne on an aging teenager. From power steering leaks to fuel filter clogs, seized brake calipers to failing map sensors, The 1VD FTV was a never-ending game of what's gonna break next. Sure, it could tow a house, but only if it didn't self-destruct first. Up next at number 11 is the Alfa Romeo Montreal V8. It had the looks of a supermodel and the soul of a race car. Yet somehow the Alfa Romeo Montreal managed to be a catastrophic disappointment. Born from the genius of Marcello Gandini, this machine had the pedigree of greatness. But under that seductive body lurked an engine and chassis combination that would make even the most devoted Alfisti shake their heads in despair. Let's start with the so-called Magic V8. Alfa didn't just slap in any engine. They took a 2.0-liter V8 from their Tipo 33 race car, civilized it, and enlarged it to 2.6 liters. Sounds promising, right? With 200 horsepower and a top speed of 230 kilometers per hour, it should have been thrilling. Instead, it was a mechanical nightmare. The main culprit? The Spica mechanical fuel injection system, a ticking time bomb of engineering misery. Around the 40,000-mile mark, the fuel injection pump would start leaking fuel into the oil system, effectively turning the car's lubrication into an unpredictable soup. Imagine your dry sump oil tank suddenly filling up with petrol. Sounds fun, doesn't it? The result? Thick plumes of smoke, poor performance, and an engine that ran like it had a death wish. And let's talk about handling. The Montreal had a curb weight that rivaled a small Planet, and its soft suspension meant that corners were approached with all the grace of a drunk ballerina. Autodelta, Alfa's motorsport division, tried to make it a race car, entering it in the 1973 World Championship for makes. The result? A 44th place qualifying spot and an early retirement due to engine failure. Even at Watkins Glen, veteran Alfa driver Teodora Ziccoli had a spirited go until the gearbox decided it had had enough and promptly exploded. In the end, Alfa soldiered on, producing just 3,925 Montreals between 1971 and 1977, before giving up entirely. A tragic case of beauty over brains, the Montreal proved that sometimes even the most breathtaking cars can be absolute disasters. Moving on to number 10, we have the AMC 304 V8. If there were a Hall of Fame for engines that promised greatness but delivered mechanical misery, the AMC 304 V8 would have its own exhibit. Complete with oil leaks, worn-out bearings, and a how-to guide on premature failure, this was the first V8 to ever grace a Jeep. But instead of ushering in a golden age of power and reliability, it quickly became the poster child for underwhelming performance and catastrophic engine issues. When it debuted in 1970, the AMC 304 had a respectable 210 horsepower and 310 pounds of torque. But then, like a slow-motion car crash, it got worse every year. By 1981, emissions regulations had choked it down to a measly 125 horsepower. That's right, a V8 that struggled to outpace a strong gust of wind. And if that wasn't bad enough, lurking beneath the hood was an oiling system so flawed, it seemed to be actively working against the engine's survival. Some engines suffer from a single design flaw. This one had an entire greatest hits collection. For starters, some blocks weren't even drilled properly, starving the rear main bearings and rods of oil. It was like AMC had a secret contest to see how many ways they could sabotage their own engine. The oil pump, frequently misaligned. Timing covers, often machined at the wrong angle, leading to gears binding up. The distributor, installed in such a way that it fought the oil system rather than working with it. And the oil pan, sometimes pressed in too far, starving the pickup of oil and setting the engine up for an early grave. Then came the aftermarket nightmare. Replacement parts were often made incorrectly. Timing sets that leaked oil like a sieve, lifters that were too small, bearings that lacked critical notches of lubrication. The result? owners left scratching their heads as if their engines burned oil, lost power, and eventually died an undignified death. Was the AMC 304 capable of greatness? Maybe, but only if built correctly, which apparently was rarer than finding a unicorn in a Jeep dealership. The Ferrari 328 GTS V8 comes in at number 9. The Ferrari 328 is one of the most usable classic Ferraris, they say. It's packed with a 3.2-liter V8, a transversely mounted rear mid-engine layout with 4 valves per cylinder. It also delivered 266 horsepower and 224 pounds of torque, rocketing to 60 miles per hour in 5.5 seconds with a top speed of 166 miles per hour. Because, let's face it, what's a Ferrari without a few terrifyingly expensive mechanical disasters lurking under the hood? Let's start with the V8 itself, a 3.2-liter transversely mounted masterpiece until you realized it had a tendency to blow its own oil cooler hoses. You see, Ferrari decided to fix the 308's low oil pressure issue by turning it up a notch. The result? Too much oil pressure. Too much pressure meant hoses occasionally exploding, enthusiastically painting the engine bay with fresh motor oil. Ferrari issued a technical service bulletin to address this, but by then, many garages had already become crime scenes of lubricant massacres. Then there was the Morelli Microplex ignition system, a fancy name for a transistor module that might as well come with a built-in self-destruct timer. It sat on top of the coil, probably contemplating its eventual failure. If you were lucky, your car had already been fixed. If not, well, hope you enjoy pushing your Ferrari. And speaking of leaks, because leaks were practically the 328's signature move, the redesigned ignition rotor came with a cam-mounted extension that had a built-in vibration damper. A brilliant idea. Except for the minor detail that it eliminated over time, letting oil gush out of the distributors like an over-enthusiastic olive oil bottle at an Italian restaurant. Let's not forget Ferrari's unique approach to front wheel bearings. Instead of simply re-greasing them like any sane manufacturer, Ferrari sealed them up. So when they wore out, you couldn't fix them. You had to replace them. The 328's heating and ventilation controls seemed to be inspired by ancient Roman engineering. Complicated, confusing, and non-functional. New replacements don't exist. Your best bet? Finding a salvage yard and hoping someone's misfortune becomes your salvation. And on to number 8 is the Porsche 928 V8. Let's talk about the Porsche 928. The car Porsche thought would replace the 911. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But what it did do was introduce a water-cooled V8 that would turn a dream drive into a financial horror show faster than you can say thrust-bearing failure. Under the hood, the 928 started with a 4.5-liter single overhead cam V8 producing 219 horsepower and eventually grew to a 5.4-liter dual overhead cam monster pushing 345 horsepower. Sounds impressive, right? Well, not when that power is interrupted by catastrophic mechanical failures. First up, the thrust-bearing failure. A lovely little issue exclusive to automatic models. Essentially, the drive shaft put so much pressure on the flywheel and drive plate that the thrust bearings inside the engine slowly disintegrated. Ignore it, and soon the crankshaft would literally start eating into the engine block. By the time you heard the ominous grinding noises, your only options were expensive machining or an entirely new engine. So much for German engineering perfection, huh? Then there was the timing belt, a thin strip of rubber responsible for keeping the entire engine from self-destructing. Post-1985 models had interference engines, meaning if the belt snapped, the valves and pistons threw an expensive party inside the engine. Porsche recommended replacing it every 50,000 miles. But enthusiasts quickly realized it was more like 45,000 miles or sooner if you liked having a working engine. Oh, and don't forget, the tensioner and water pump had to be changed at the same time. A lot of people learned that the hard way. Oh, let's not forget about those electrical gremlins too. Remember hard starts, weird gauge readings, headlights that pop up on their own? Welcome to the 928 experience. Bad ground points were the usual suspects, but the sheer volume of sensors meant electrical failures were as common as overpriced Porsche repairs. But under that muscular exterior lurked a V8 engine determined to test your patience, your wallet, and your roadside assistance membership. The 6.0-liter Gen 4 V8, the L98, pumped out 362 horsepower and 530 Nm of torque. But what it also did was introduce owners to a variety of mechanical failures that could turn a simple Sunday cruise into a breakdown survival exercise. Let's start with the harmonic balancer, or, as some call it, the part that wobbles itself to death. The shock unit on VE V8s had a charming tendency to shake like an out-of-balance washing machine, which led to the AC belt flying off at the worst possible moment. You'd think Holden would have fixed this after the LS1, but no, consistency is key, even when it comes to bad engineering. Then there's the water pump, a legacy issue from LS1 days. One moment it's fine, and the next it's leaking like a politician's promises. The high-pressure relief valve was notorious for failing without warning, which meant your coolant ended up everywhere except inside the engine where it belonged. And since cooling failures led to overheating, overheating leads to blown gaskets. And blown gaskets lead to crying in the driveway. This wasn't a problem you could ignore. Speaking of cooling, the radiator was a mix of aluminum and plastic, which sounds great until you realize that plastic and extreme heat cycles don't mix. Over time, the plastic end tanks became as brittle as a retiree's hip, cracking and leaking coolant at the worst possible moment. And if that wasn't enough, the heater hose connectors, fitted with quick snap fittings, liked to snap off completely, leaving you with a sudden, unplanned steam explosion under the bonnet. The VE was the first Commodore with a saddle-style fuel tank, and when the pump went, so did your ability to move. The worst part, replacing it required lowering the rear subframe, which turned a simple repair into a labor-intensive nightmare. Bonus feature, the built-in fuel filter meant if one component failed, everything had to be replaced. Let's not forget the rocker arms on the final LS3-powered models. Holden sourced these from a new supplier, which apparently forgot that rocker arms shouldn't fail at 50,000 miles. The result? Loud ticking noises, misfires, and in some cases, complete engine failure before that new car smell even faded. In the end, the VE Commodore was a car with presence, power, and a special talent for braking in expensive ways. Next up, at 6 is the Chevrolet Vega 262 V8. The 1970s were a rough time for General Motors. But if you needed a shining example of how not to build a V8, look no further than the Chevrolet Vega 262. Imagine a car designed to be lightweight and efficient, then crammed with a V8 so underwhelming, it barely outran some four cylinders. The Vega's 262 cubic inch 4.3-liter small block was supposed to bring muscle to the compact segment, but instead it limped onto the scene as one of GM's biggest engineering faceplants. Let's start with the basics. The 262 V8 was essentially a shrunken-down version of GM's legendary small block, featuring a two-barrel carburetor and producing a breathtakingly weak 110 horsepower and 195 pounds of torque. That's right, this so-called V8 muscle had barely more power than a base model inline six of the era. The decision to downsize the engine was meant to improve fuel economy during the oil crisis. But instead, it delivered the worst of both worlds: lackluster performance and questionable reliability. One of the first signs of trouble was overheating. This engine ran hot, like Vegas in July hot. The small, inadequate radiator struggled to keep up, and thanks to GM's cost-cutting genius, early models didn't even come with a coolant overflow tank. When the engine got too warm, excess coolant simply poured onto the ground. Forget checking your fluid levels. By the time you noticed the temperature gauge creeping up, your head gasket was already making a break for it. Speaking of head gasket, it was practically a sacrificial offering to the gods of engine failure. GM paired an iron block with aluminum cylinder heads, a classic mismatch in thermal expansion rates. Good one, guys. As the engine heated and cooled, the heads and block expanded at different rates. Gee, I wonder why, leading to gasket failures, coolant leaks, and eventually warped cylinder heads. If you had a Vega 262 V8, chances were good that you were on a first-name basis with your mechanic. Oil consumption was another running joke, except for Vega owners, who weren't laughing. The valve stem seals were made of a rubber compound that hardened, cracked, and then let oil seep into the combustion chamber. The result? A trail of blue smoke followed Vega V8s like a depressing parade float. And then there was the exhaust note, or rather, the lack of one. Normally, a V8 brings a satisfying growl, a deep rumble that lets everyone know power is under the hood. Not the Vega 262. Thanks to its asthmatic two-barrel carburetor and strangled exhaust system, this engine sounded more like an overworked sewing machine than a muscle car. And it was an embarrassment to the V8 legacy. By the late 1970s, GM realized their mistake and quietly buried the 262 Vega. May it rest in peace. Replacing it with engines that weren't quite as hopeless. But the damage was already done. And next on the list at number 5 is the 5.9-liter Dodge Magnum V8. Let's talk about an engine that had tried its best, but still ended up on the wrong side of history. The Dodge 5.9-liter Magnum V8. Chrysler threw this thing into trucks, SUVs, and even some Jeeps from 1992 to 2003. And while it was built to work hard, it also had a knack for falling apart in spectacular fashion. If there was an award for most likely to leave you stranded at the worst possible moment, the 5.9 Magnum would have been a strong contender. For starters, let's discuss power, or, as you can imagine, the lack thereof. The Magnum V8 churned out a rather unimpressive 230 to 250 horsepower, which was already underwhelming in the 90s and became outright embarrassing when compared to competitors like GM's LS engines or Ford's Triton V8s. Despite this modest output, the 5.9 managed to guzzle fuel like a full-blown muscle car. If you drove one with anything other than a feather-light touch, you were looking at fuel economy figures that resembled a horror movie. 7 to 10 miles per gallon. And that's being generous. Now, let's move on to the failures. First, there's the infamous plenum gasket issue. Chrysler, in its infinite wisdom, decided to put a 2-piece intake manifold on this thing, sealing it with a fragile gasket that almost seemed designed to fail. Good one. When it inevitably did, air leaks wreaked havoc on the fuel mixture. Wow, I can't believe that happened, causing excessive oil consumption, poor performance, and enough carbon buildup to make environmentalists weep. Left unchecked, this problem could clog the catalytic converters, overheat the engine, and turn your Magnum into, you guessed it, a ticking time bomb. Then we have the cylinder heads. Dodge proudly introduced these as an improvement over the old LA series heads. But they forgot one small detail. they crack. And not just occasionally. Over half of the 5.9 Magnums out there developed cracks in the cylinder heads, often near the valve seats. These cracks led to oil burning, compression loss, and the slow, painful death of many engines. Owners who didn't catch this issue early would eventually find themselves in the middle of an expensive head gasket blowing nightmare. The timing chain was another weak point. Around 100,000 miles, it would stretch like an old rubber band, throwing off engine timing and inviting all sorts of mechanical chaos. To make things even more frustrating, Dodge paired the 5.9 Magnum with transmissions that seemed allergic to longevity. The 46RE and 46RH automatics had a nasty habit of failing before the truck even hit middle age, often requiring expensive rebuilds or replacements. And if you thought the engine's failures were bad, just wait until you have to deal with the front-end components. The extra weight of the 5.9 chewed through ball joints, U-joints, and tie rods. So, was the 5.9 Magnum a complete disaster? Absolutely. It was thirsty, underpowered, failure-prone, and expensive to maintain. Sure, it had a reputation for longevity if you're willing to baby it, but for most owners, it was a lesson in frustration. Dodge retired the 5.9 in favor of the 5.7 Hemi in 2003, and honestly, it couldn't have come soon enough. At 4, we have the TVR Rover V8. The TVR Rover V8, where British engineering met chaos, and chaos won. Born from the ever-aging Rover V8, this engine saw action in various TVRs, from the Griffith to the Chimera. But while TVR had the spirit of a mad scientist, the Rover V8 had the durability of a soggy biscuit. What started as a lightweight aluminum block V8 turned into an overheating, gasket-blowing, oil-guzzling catastrophe. First, let's talk about the infamous overheating problem. Seems a common theme here in this list, doesn't it? The geniuses at Land Rover thought it would be a brilliant idea to bump up the operating temperature to 96 degrees. Good one, geniuses. Add in a top radiator hose that loved to trap air, a water pump with the lifespan of a mayfly, and an aluminum block that expanded like a balloon when things got hot, and you had the perfect recipe for disaster. The result? Cylinder liner failure. When those liners slipped, combustion gases leaked into places they shouldn't, and boom! Your engine became a very expensive paperweight. The 4.0-liter version suffered the most, with failure rates skyrocketing after 1994. Then there was the head gasket fiasco. Rover V8s had a habit of eating their own head gaskets, especially the larger displacements. The problem wasn't just overheating, it was poor block design. The 3.5-liter engine had thick cylinder walls, but as Rover boarded out to 3.9 liters and beyond, those walls got dangerously thin. Combine that with dodgy coolant circulation, and the head gasket gave up faster than a TVR electrical system in the rain. If coolant started vanishing mysteriously, odds were it was getting vaporized inside the engine. And let's not forget ignition woes. Distributor models had coils that would randomly decide not to change properly, cutting power like an angry landlord pulling the plug on your electricity. The distributor cap corroded, and plug leads aged worse than British pop music from the 90s. In short, the TVR Rover V8 was a masterpiece of British stubbornness, underpowered, unreliable, and ready to explode at any moment. But hey, at least it sounded good while doing it. Coming in at number 3 is the Mercedes M100 6.3-liter V8. The Mercedes M100 6.3-liter V8 wasn't just an engine. It was a statement. A 6.3-liter iron block aluminum-headed beast built with the kind of overkill only 1960s Mercedes engineers could dream up. With forged pistons, sodium-filled valves, and a mechanical fuel injection system, it was a technical marvel on paper. The European version pumped out 286 horsepower and 406 pounds of torque, while the North American variant, choked by emissions regulations, wheezed out 250 horsepower and 360 pounds of torque. It was bench tested for 265 minutes before installation, 40 of which were at full load, because apparently this engine needed a warm-up longer than most commutes. But for all its engineering ambition, the M100 had just one fatal flaw. It was a mechanical disaster waiting to happen. It guzzled fuel at an alarming rate, averaging single-digit miles per gallon on a good day. If you were feeling particularly spirited behind the wheel, you could literally watch the fuel gauge drop like an hourglass counting down to bankruptcy. And with a 12-liter oil capacity, oil changes weren't just maintenance. They were an event. Mercedes, in their infinite wisdom, recommended changes only every 20,000 kilometers, which sounds convenient until you realize the engine consumed enough oil between services to make that interval meaningless. The mechanical fuel injection system was another ticking time bomb. We love that phrase around here. It worked brilliantly until it didn't. When it failed, and it would, finding a mechanic who would understand its arcane workings was about as easy as finding a payphone in 2025. The later Bosch Jetronic system was marginally better, but still a nightmare compared to modern fuel injection. And if you were lucky enough to own a 600 limousine, congratulations! Your engine wasn't just controlling itself, it was also powering a ridiculous hydraulic system that controlled everything from the windows to the trunk. The problem? Hydraulic leaks. And when they happened, which they always did, fixing them was a financial horror story. Then there was the sheer size of this thing. The M100 was so massive that when Mercedes decided to enlarge it to 6.8 liters, they had to install a dry sump oil system just to make it fit. Try pushing it past 4,000 RPM, and you could almost hear it sigh in exhaustion. In the end, the M100 was everything Mercedes stood for. Overengineered, overcomplicated, and absurdly expensive to maintain. It was a legend, but for all the wrong reasons. Next, at 2 is the BMW N63 V8. The BMW N63 V8 was introduced in 2008, promising cutting-edge twin-turbo technology and monstrous power. It featured a 4.4-liter displacement or 4.0-liter in China, a dual overhead cam valve train with dual vanos, and a compression ratio of 10:1. With 402 to 523 horsepower and 443 to 553 pounds of torque, it looked like a masterpiece on paper, but in reality, it was less German engineering and more mechanical self-sabotage. First up, oil consumption. BMW must have thought engines should double as oil furnaces, because the N63 burned through oil faster than owners could top it up. The factory response? Just add more oil. A strategy about as effective as refilling a sinking boat. The excessive oil burn led to clogged catalytic converters, worn piston rings, and you guessed it, engines mysteriously running out of lubrication. Then came the turbocharger failures. The N63's brilliant hot V design placed the turbos inside the V of the engine for faster spool times. Unfortunately, it also trapped heat like an oven. Roasting the turbos into oblivion. If your accelerator suddenly felt like pedaling a bicycle uphill, congratulations, you needed new turbos, and your wallet was about to suffer. The valve stem seals were another horror story. Instead of keeping oil where it belonged, these seals let it leak into the combustion chamber, producing beautiful blue smoke clouds at stoplights. Nothing screams luxury BMW like looking like an old diesel truck struggling up a hill. And of course, the timing chain disaster. BMW decided that plastic chain guides were a good idea. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Over time, these guides wore out, cracked, and disintegrated, causing timing chains to stretch or snap completely. If you ignored the ominous rattling noise from your engine, your next drive might end with catastrophic engine failure. Still not convinced the N63 was a ticking time bomb? There's that phrase again. How about coolant leaks, carbon buildup, fuel injector failures, and astronomical maintenance costs? Have I talked you into it yet? Things got so bad that BMW had to introduce a customer appreciation program in 2014. That's a polite way of admitting, yes, we built an engine that eats itself. In the end, the N63 wasn't just unreliable. It was a financial black hole. If you owned one, you either loved pain or had a mechanic on speed dial. And for the engine that tops our list for the most flawed and weirdest V8 engine ever made is the Jaguar AJV8. The Jaguar AJV8 was supposed to be a refined, modern masterpiece. A 4.0-liter dual overhead cam V8 pushing out 290 horsepower, or 375 horsepower with a supercharger. By 2003, a larger 4.2-liter version arrived with an improved valve train, block, and cooling system. It featured variable valve timing, a sophisticated fuel injection system, and an aluminum block to keep weight down. On paper, it was a smooth, high-tech engine that brought Jaguar into the modern era. In reality, it was an unpredictable British aristocrat, charming yet riddled with flaws that made ownership feel like a long-term financial punishment. Timing chain problems were the AJV8's most notorious issue. Early models from 1998 to 2001 were cursed with plastic timing chain guides that cracked under stress. Could have seen that coming, guys. When they failed, they sent the engine into a violent tantrum of rattling and misfires before self-destructing. By 2002, Jaguar finally switched to metal guides and double row change. Good going, guys. But if oil changes were ignored, even these improvements didn't last long. And speaking of oil, the AJV8 was about as forgiving as a scorned ex. If you skipped a few changes, expect sludge buildup, timing chain damage, and a slow, expensive death. Then there was the infamous Nicosil debacle. In the late 90s, Jaguar decided to coat the cylinder walls with Nicosil, a material that had worked fine for Porsche and BMW. Unfortunately, Jaguar didn't consider the sulfur-heavy fuel in certain markets. When combined with condensation, it formed sulfuric acid. Yes, actual acid, which slowly ate away the cylinder walls. The result? You guessed it, a complete loss of compression, making the engine about as useful as a paperweight. Jaguar eventually switched to steel liners in 2000, but by then, many engines had already suffered a slow, painful death. In the end, the AJV8 was an engine that demanded constant attention. Ignore it for too long, and it would find new and creative ways to punish you. Classic Jaguar. Classic.